All right, everyone, buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into a story that's sending shockwaves through, well, pretty much everywhere. Elon Musk versus the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB.
Yeah, and this isn't just about some, let's say, strongly worded tweets this time around.
Definitely not.
We're talking about Musk's allies working through his Department of Government Efficiency,
DOGE.
right, DOGE. They're actually inside the CFPB,
Yeah.
talking with staff, poking around their systems. It's, well, let's just say it's raising some eyebrows.
And some serious questions about what's really going on here. I mean, what exactly is Musk's game plan?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But before we get lost in the conspiracy theories,
Right.
maybe we should take a step back and make sure everyone's on the same page about what the CFPB actually does.
Totally agree. It can get confusing with all the acronyms and everything. So, for anyone who might not be totally familiar, could you give us a quick rundown of the CFTB? What's their deal?
Sure. The CFPB, it came about after that whole 2010 financial crisis mess. You know, the one that almost brought down the...
The whole economy, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, it was Elizabeth Warren's idea back when she was a professor.
Oh, right.
The idea was, to create this watchdog to keep an eye on banks and financial institutions, make sure they're not pulling any shady stuff.
Protecting consumers, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Things like predatory lending, unfair credit card practices, all that jazz. They're supposed to be the referees, making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
So they're like the financial police.
Haha. Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, but I've also heard that the CFPB has been kind of controversial from the start. Why is that?
Well, it depends who you ask, but some people, especially on the, let's say the more conservative side, and some folks in the financial industry, they've always argued that the CFPB is, overstepping its boundaries.
Overreaching. Too much government regulation.
Right, exactly. They say it stifles innovation, hurts businesses, all that.
So basically, they think the CFTB is too big, too powerful, too meddlesome.
Pretty much.
And that's where Elon Musk comes in, right? I mean, with his whole shrink the government mission.
Bingo.
He's been pretty vocal about it. And not just with the CFTB, he's gone after other agencies, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Remember that whole thing with USAID?
The U.S. Agency for International Development.
Yep. Musk basically called for it to be scrapped entirely, said it was a waste of taxpayer money.
Wow. And he's also tangled with the Treasury Department, right?
Uh-huh. He's been pushing for them to streamline their operations, cut spending, all that jazz. He's not a fan of what he sees as bureaucratic bloat.
So basically, Musk sees the CFPB as just another example of government overreach.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And he's using DOGE to shake things up a bit.
But how did his allies actually get inside the CFPB? Did they just walk in the front door and say, hey, we're here to fix things?
Well, no, not exactly. The details are still kind of fuzzy.
Right.
But it seems like they were given access to some of the CFPB's IT systems. Yeah, and they've been, communicating directly with staff.
So basically, they're embedded in the CFPB.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it's caused a major uproar. The CFPB Employees Union is calling it an incursion. They're worried about data security, potential breaches.
It's a pretty bold move, no matter how you slice it. And I'm guessing the CFPB staff isn't exactly thrilled about having Musk's team essentially looking over their shoulders.
You're right about that. They're furious. Reports suggest the atmosphere inside the agency is, well, let's just say it's not very welcoming. Lots of tension, lots of distrust.
Okay, so we've got Musk's team inside the CFPB, and we know he's not a fan of the agency, to put it mildly. But what's the real motivation here? Is this just some kind of philosophical crusade against big government, or is there something more to it?
Now that's the question, isn't it? And it's where things start to get really interesting, because Musk's motives might be a bit more complex than they appear at first glance.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What do you mean?
Well, think about this. Musk's social media platform, X, just partnered with Visa to create a real-time payment system.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
Now, that kind of system, it's likely going to fall under the CFPB's regulatory authority.
I see where you're going with this.
Some folks are saying that Musk's whole attack on the CFPB might be, at least in part, about weakening the very agency that could potentially regulate his own businesses.
So it's a potential conflict of interest?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
He's going after an agency that could have a say in how his own company operates. And let's not forget those tweets. CFPB, RIP, that one was pretty ominous. And he's called to delete CFPB before, too.
Yeah, those tweets definitely don't paint him as a big fan of the agency.
Exactly. The tweets plus the whole DOGE thing, it all points to Musk having some pretty strong feelings about the CFPB. But the question is, what's his end goal? Does he really want to get rid of it entirely, or does he have something else in mind?
Okay, so we've got Musk's team embedded in the CFPB, possibly with some serious conflicts of interest. We know he wants to shrink the government, but we're not quite sure what he's ultimately trying to do. But what's the reaction been like? I imagine this whole thing has stirred up some strong opinions.
You'd be absolutely right about that. The reaction to all this has been, well, let's just say it's been explosive. People have some very strong opinions about the CFPB, about Musk's involvement. It really reflects how divided people are about the whole role of government and the influence of, powerful individuals.
Yeah, no kidding. So let's break it down. Who's on Musk's side here and who's pushing back?
Well, it's no surprise that Musk's supporters and those who've been saying the CFPB has been overreaching for years, they're cheering him on.
Makes sense.
A lot of Republicans, who generally favor less government regulation, they're on board with this. They think the CFPB has been too aggressive, stifling businesses with all those regulations.
So for them, Musk's like a hero coming in to cut through all the red tape.
Exactly. He's the disruptor, shaking things up in Washington. But on the other side, you've got Democrats and consumer groups who are sounding the alarm. They're worried about what happens if the CFPB gets weakened.
Yeah, what are their concerns? Why are they so worried?
They argue that the CFPB is absolutely essential for protecting consumers, from those predatory lending practices, discrimination, all the stuff we talked about earlier.
Right.
They point to all the money the CFPB has recovered for people who were victims of these practices as proof that it's working.
Billions of dollars.
Yeah, billions. And they're worried that if Musk gets his way and weakens the CFPB, consumers are going to be vulnerable. They'll be at the mercy of these powerful financial institutions.
So it's a classic battle between, free market folks who want less regulation and those who think the government needs to play a strong role in protecting people.
Exactly. And it's not just happening in Congress either. There have been protests outside CFPB headquarters. People are worried about data security, about whether DOGE should even be involved in the first place.
Yeah. And what it all means for the future.
Right. It's fascinating how this has become such a flashpoint for these bigger debates about the role of government, the power of wealthy individuals.
Right.
It raises questions about accountability, transparency. I mean, DOGE isn't a traditional government agency.
Right. It was created by Musk.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not much clarity about its authority, who oversees it, even where its funding comes from.
That does seem a bit unsettling. If one rich person can just set up their own organization and use it to influence a federal agency. I mean, what's to stop others from doing the same thing?
That's the fear, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it sets a dangerous precedent. Critics are saying this could really undermine democracy, giving too much power to people with lots of money, potentially tilting the playing field in their favor.
And we're already seeing some real-world effects from DOGE being at the CFPB.
Oh, absolutely. One of the first things Scott Besson did after being appointed acting director, and many believe that was Musk's doing. One of the first things he did was put a hold on a bunch of the CFPB's work, like developing new regulations, public communications, stuff like that.
So they're basically putting the brakes on everything the CFPB has been doing.
Essentially, yeah. And of course, Republicans who want to rein in the agency, they're happy about it. But Democrats and consumer groups, they see it as an attempt to cripple the CFPB, to stop it from doing its job. It really shows how much this whole thing is being seen through a partisan lens.
Yeah, it definitely seems like finding any middle ground on this is going to be tough. But let's zoom out a bit. What are the potential long-term consequences of what Musk's doing here? Could this have an impact beyond just the CFPB?
That's a really important question. The CFPB gets its money from the Federal Reserve, right?
Right.
And the director has a lot of control over how that money's spent. So if someone who agrees with Musk's views becomes the permanent director, they could essentially starve the CFPB of resources, make it impossible for it to function.
That's kind of scary to think about. I mean, the CFPB has done a lot to hold financial institutions accountable. If it gets weakened or even dismantled, it could have serious consequences for consumers.
Absolutely. It could mean fewer protections against predatory lending, unfair debt collection, discrimination.
Right.
Consumers could end up paying more, having fewer choices, and being at a much higher risk of financial harm.
And this could also set a precedent for how other billionaires interact with government agencies, right?
That's definitely a concern. Could this encourage other super wealthy individuals to try to influence the agencies that regulate their industries? I mean, imagine if billionaires started treating government agencies like their own personal chessboards.
Using their money and connections to change the rules to benefit themselves.
Exactly. It would be a huge blow to public trust in government,
Yeah.
and it would make the inequality that already exists even worse.
And that brings us back to those protests outside the CFPB. Those people aren't just worried about data security or even the future of one specific agency. They're worried about the erosion of democracy and the concentration of power in the hands of a few.
You're absolutely right. They see this as a fight for what kind of society we want to live in. One where everyone has a fair chance, or one where your fate is determined by how much money and influence you have.
Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here. Potential budget cuts, regulatory rollbacks, a potential shift in the balance of power, and a whole lot of uncertainty about what Musk's ultimate goal is. But what's going on inside the CFPB right now? How are the employees who are dealing with this upheaval firsthand coping?
Well, you can imagine the atmosphere at the CFPB is pretty tense. I mean, having Elon Musk's team basically camped out in your office, analyzing your every move, potentially having a say in your future, it can't be a very comforting feeling.
Yeah, I can only imagine the stress and anxiety they must be going through. It's like their whole world's been turned upside down.
The CFPB Employees Union has been really outspoken against DOGE being there. They call it an invasion, accuse Musk's team of acting like they own the place.
Wow.
And it's not just about how it looks either. They're seriously concerned about data security, potential breaches of sensitive information.
What are they saying specifically?
Well, they're saying that DOGE's team doesn't have the proper security clearances or the expertise to be accessing the CFPB systems, which have incredibly sensitive data about consumers and financial institutions.
Right.
They're worried about the possibility of this information being misused or compromised. And it's not just the regular employees who are worried. Even some of the higher-ups at the CFPB have expressed concerns.
Have there been any, confrontations?
There have been reports of some pretty heated meetings, some clashes between CFPB staff and DOGE's team. Some employees have said that Musk's allies are arrogant, dismissive, disrespectful, like they don't value the work and expertise of the CFPB staff.
It sounds like things could get really ugly, and all the uncertainty about what's going to happen to the CFPB is probably just making things worse.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Nobody knows for sure what Musk's endgame is. Does he really want to dismantle the CFPB completely, or is he trying to reshape it to fit his own vision? This uncertainty is creating a lot of anxiety and unease within the agency.
And all this is happening at a time when the CFPB's workload is actually increasing. Consumer complaints are up, and there are all these new financial technologies popping up that need to be regulated.
It's a perfect storm, really. And it's raising concerns that the CFPB might not be able to effectively protect consumers. They're being stretched thin at the exact moment they're facing this existential threat.
We've talked a lot about the internal turmoil at the CFPB, but what about the pressure from outside the agency? What are consumer groups and other stakeholders doing about all this?
Oh, they're not just sitting back and watching. They're mobilizing, launching public awareness campaigns, putting pressure on lawmakers to defend the CFPB. They see this as a make-or-break moment for consumer rights.
What are their biggest worries?
They argue that the CFPB has been essential in leveling the playing field between consumers and powerful financial institutions.
Right.
They're afraid that weakening or getting rid of the CFPB would be a huge setback for consumer protection.
And they're also worried about those same potential conflicts of interest with Musk, right?
Exactly. Given his own ventures in the fintech world, they're concerned that he might try to use his influence over the CFPB to weaken regulations that could affect his own companies or push for policies that give him a competitive advantage.
It's a valid concern, and it really highlights how important transparency and accountability are in government. We need to be sure that decisions about things that affect consumers are being made in the public interest, not to benefit a select few. So we have the CFPB Employees Union trying to protect their agency, consumer groups raising the alarm about the risks to consumers, and lawmakers caught in the middle of a partisan battle.
It's a high-stakes fight, with the future of consumer protection hanging in the balance.
And as we've seen throughout this deep dive, it's a situation with implications that reach far beyond just one agency. We're talking about the role of government, the balance of power, and the very foundations of our democracy.
Exactly. And it's a story that's still developing, one we'll need to keep a close eye on in the coming months and years. But I think it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture here. This whole thing with Musk and the CFPB, it's a microcosm of a much larger trend we're seeing in society.
What do you mean?
We're living in a time when technology is rapidly changing every part of our lives, including the financial world. And as these changes keep accelerating, the regulations we have in place are being tested. The CFPB was created to address the challenges of the 2008 financial crisis, but the world's a very different place now. The rise of fintech, cryptocurrencies, decentralized finance, it's all creating a whole new set of challenges and opportunities that traditional regulators are struggling to keep up with.
So you're saying that this clash between Musk and the CFPB is about more than just one agency or one individual. It's about the fundamental question of how we regulate these new technologies and ensure they benefit society as a whole.
Exactly. And it's a question with no easy answers. We need to protect consumers from fraud, abuse, and systemic risks, but we also don't want to stifle innovation or make it too hard for new businesses and technologies to get started.
It's a tough balancing act. And it requires a nuanced and thoughtful approach, not just reacting emotionally or getting stuck in ideological battles.
I agree. We need to move beyond the simplistic ideas that all regulation is bad or innovation is always good. We need to have a deeper conversation about how we can harness the power of these new technologies while also protecting consumers and making sure we have a fair and equitable financial system.
That's a great point. This situation is forcing us to confront these fundamental questions about the role of technology, the future of regulation, and the balance of power in our society. And it's a conversation we all need to be part of, not just experts and policymakers, but everyday citizens too.
Couldn't agree more. This isn't some abstract policy debate. It's about real people's lives, their jobs, their financial security. We need to make sure our voices are heard and that our interests are represented in this rapidly changing world.
It feels like we're at a crossroads. We have all these powerful new technologies emerging, and we're trying to figure out how to regulate them without killing their potential. It's complicated, and this whole Musk CFPB saga is right at the heart of it.
And what's so interesting is that this isn't just about politics in Washington or financial regulations. It reflects a broader societal shift where technology is blurring the lines between the public and private sectors. Individuals with incredible wealth and influence are able to exert power in ways we've never seen before.
That's a really insightful point. It's like we're in uncharted waters, and we're still figuring out the rules of the game as we go along.
Precisely. And that's what makes this story so compelling. It forces us to confront fundamental questions about power, accountability, and the future of our institutions. What role should individuals have in shaping public policy? How do we balance innovation with consumer protection? How do we ensure that our government serves the needs of all citizens, not just the wealthy and powerful?
Those are big questions, and it's a lot to think about. So where do we go from here? What are the potential outcomes of all of this?
Honestly, it's difficult to say for sure what the future holds. But one thing's clear. What happens with this battle between Musk and the CFPB will have a major impact on the future of consumer protection and the overall financial landscape.
What are some of the scenarios that could play out?
Well, one possibility is that Musk gets what he wants and weakens or dismantles the CFPB. If that happens, we could see a rollback of regulations, less oversight of financial institutions, and a higher risk of consumers getting hurt. It could also encourage other wealthy individuals to try to exert their influence over government agencies, tilting the balance of power even further in their favor.
That's a pretty grim outlook. Is there a more optimistic possibility?
There's always hope. Another possibility is that the public outcry, the pushback from lawmakers and consumer groups, is strong enough to protect the CFPB and preserve its ability to protect consumers. That would send a message that we as a society value strong government oversight of the financial industry and that we won't stand for attempts to weaken those protections.
And there's also the possibility that we end up somewhere in between, right? Maybe the CFPB survives but comes out weaker or with less authority.
Definitely a possibility. And the outcome would likely depend on a number of things, like who wins the 2024 election, who gets appointed as the next CFPB director, and how much pressure the public puts on lawmakers.
So there's a lot at stake here. And it's not just about the future of one agency. It's about consumer protection, the role of government in regulating technology, and the balance of power in our society.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial for people to stay informed, get involved in these discussions, and make their voices heard. This isn't just something to watch from the sidelines. We all have a responsibility to shape the future.
I completely agree. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to turn it over to you, the listener. What are your thoughts on all this? What are your biggest concerns? What questions do you still have?
We encourage you to keep digging into this issue, stay updated on the latest developments, and let your voice be heard. Reach out to your elected officials and let them know where you stand on the CFPB and the broader issue of consumer protection. Write to your local newspaper, share your thoughts on social media, talk to your friends and family.
Because at the end of the day, the future of these agencies and the policies they create is in our hands as citizens. We need to demand transparency, accountability, and a system that works for everyone, not just the privileged few.
That's the power of knowledge, and that's what the deep dive is all about. Giving you the information and insights you need to understand the complex world we live in and make informed decisions.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll continue to explore the most pressing issues of our time, bringing you in-depth analysis and thought-provoking perspectives.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
And remember, the fight for a fair and just society never really ends. It requires our constant attention and our unwavering commitment to holding power accountable.
That's the beauty of knowledge, and that's what the deep dive is all about.
Thanks for listening.
It's kind of like he's seen as a knight in shining armor, coming in to slay the regulatory dragon.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So they love that he's shaking things up. But you mentioned the other side.
Right. On the other side, you've got Democrats and those consumer advocacy groups, and they are really sounding the alarm. They're worried about what will happen if the CFPB gets weakened.
So what are they so worried about? What are their main concerns?
Well, they say that the CFPB is absolutely essential for protecting consumers, preventing those predatory lending practices, discrimination, all the stuff we talked about. And they point to the money the CFPB has gotten back for victims of these practices. They say that proves it's working.
Yeah, billions of dollars, right?
Billions, yep. And they're worried that if Musk succeeds in weakening the CFPB, well, consumers are going to be left vulnerable, at the mercy of these big financial institutions.
So it's like that classic battle, the free market folks versus the ones who think the government needs to step in and protect people.
Exactly. And this isn't just a fight happening in Congress either. We've seen protests outside CFPB headquarters. People are worried about data security, about whether DOGE should even be involved.
Yeah. And what it all means for the future.
Right. It's crazy how this has become this huge flashpoint. It brings up all these bigger questions about, the role of government, the power of wealthy people. Yeah. It raises these questions about accountability, transparency. I mean, when you think about it, DOGE isn't a typical government agency.
Right. It was Musk who tried it.
Exactly. So it's not really clear what their authority is, who's overseeing them, even where their funding is coming from.
That is a little unsettling when you think about it that way. If one really wealthy person can just go and create their own organization and use it to influence a federal agency, what's stopping others from doing the same thing?
And that's the big fear, right? That this sets a really dangerous precedent. Critics are saying this could undermine democracy. It gives too much power to people with tons of money. And it could tilt the playing field, to benefit them.
And there are already some real-world impacts from DOGE being at the CFPB.
Oh, absolutely. One of the first things that Scott Bessent did after being appointed acting director, and it's widely believed that Musk was behind that appointment.
Right.
Anyway, one of the first things he did was put a bunch of CFPB activities on hold. Things like developing new regulations, public communications, that kind of stuff.
So they're essentially stopping the CFPB from doing its job.
Basically, yeah. And of course, Republicans who want to see the CFPB's power reduced, they're happy about it. But the Democrats, consumer groups, they see it as an attempt to cripple the CFPB, stop it from doing what it's supposed to do. It really shows how partisan this whole issue is.
It doesn't sound like finding a compromise is going to be easy. But let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture. What are the possible long-term consequences of all this? Could it go beyond just the CFPB?
That's a really important question. CFPB gets its funding from the Federal Reserve.
Right.
And the director has a lot of say in how that money is spent. So if someone who agrees with Musk becomes the permanent director, they could basically starve the CFPB of resources, make it impossible for it to work properly.
That's a scary thought. I mean, the CFPB's done a lot of good work in holding these financial institutions accountable. If they get weakened or worse, dismantled, that could be really bad for consumers.
It really could. It could mean less protection against, predatory lending, debt collectors, discrimination. Consumers could end up paying more for things, having fewer choices, and just being at a much higher risk of being taken advantage of financially.
And this could set a precedent for how other billionaires interact with government agencies.
That's definitely a worry. It could encourage other super-rich people to try to influence the agencies that regulate their industries.
Mm.
Imagine if every billionaire started treating government agencies like their own personal game, changing the rules to benefit themselves.
Using their money and connections to manipulate things.
Exactly. It would really erode public trust in the government, and it would just make the inequality in our society so much worse.
And that's what those protests outside CFPB headquarters are really about. They're not just worried about data security or the future of one agency. They're worried about democracy itself and the concentration of power in the hands of a few.
That's it, exactly. They're fighting for the kind of society we want to live in. One where everyone has a fair chance, or one where your success is determined by your wealth and influence.
Okay, we've got a lot to think about here. Potential budget cuts, regulatory changes, shifts in power, and a lot of uncertainty about what Musk's real goal is. But let's shift gears a bit. What's happening inside the CFPB right now? How are those employees handling all this upheaval?
Well, it's pretty tense in there. I mean, can you imagine having Elon Musk's team camped out in your office, analyzing everything you do, potentially having a say in whether you keep your job? It's got to be nerve-wracking.
Yeah, the stress and anxiety must be through the roof. It's like their world has been completely flipped upside down.
The CFPB Employees Union has been very vocal in their opposition to DOGE's presence. They're calling it an invasion and accusing Musk's team of acting like they own the place.
Wow.
And they're not just complaining about appearances. They're seriously worried about data security, about the potential for sensitive information to be leaked or misused.
What specifically are they saying?
They're saying that DOGE's team doesn't have the right security clearances or the expertise to be poking around in the CFPB systems, which contain incredibly sensitive data about consumers and financial institutions.
Right.
They're worried about this information being misused or compromised. And it's not just the rank-and-file employees who are worried either. Some senior officials at the CFPB have voiced concerns as well.
Have there been any actual confrontations?
There have been reports of some heated arguments, some clashes between CFPB staff and DOGE's team. Some employees have said Musk's allies are arrogant, dismissive, like they don't respect the work that the CFPB staff does or their expertise.
It sounds like a really volatile situation, and the uncertainty about the future of the CFPB is probably just adding fuel to the fire.
Absolutely. Nobody knows for sure what Musk's endgame is here. Does he really want to completely dismantle the CFPB, or is he trying to reshape it to fit his own vision? All this uncertainty is creating a lot of anxiety.
And all this is happening while the CFPB's workload is actually increasing. Consumer complaints are going up, and there are all these new financial technologies emerging that need to be regulated.
It's a perfect storm. And it raises the question of whether the CFPB can effectively protect consumers under these conditions. They're being stretched thin at a time when they're facing an existential threat.
We've talked about the turmoil within the CFPB.
Right.
What about the external pressure? What are consumer advocacy groups and other stakeholders doing about all this?
Oh, they're not just sitting on the sidelines. They're mobilizing, launching public awareness campaigns, putting pressure on lawmakers to defend the CFPB. They see this as a crucial moment for consumer rights.
What are their main worries?
They're saying that the CFPB has been really important in creating a more level playing field between consumers and these powerful financial institutions.
Right.
They're worried that if the CFPB is weakened or eliminated, it would be a huge step backward for consumer protection.
And they're worried about those potential conflicts of interest with Musk, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Given his ventures in financial technology, they're concerned that he might use his influence over the CFPB to try and change regulations to benefit his companies or give himself a competitive edge.
That's a legitimate concern, and it really highlights how important transparency and accountability are in government. We need to make sure that decisions affecting consumers are being made for the right reasons, not just to benefit a select few. So we have the CFPB Employees Union fighting to protect their agency, consumer groups sounding the alarm about risks to consumers, and lawmakers caught in this partisan battle.
It's a really high-stakes fight, and the future of consumer protection hangs in the balance. It really is. And it brings up these really important questions, about accountability and transparency. I mean, DOGE isn't a typical government agency, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, it was created by Musk.
Exactly. So there's not a ton of clarity about, their authority, who oversees them, even where their funding comes from.
Yeah, that does seem a bit unsettling, to think that one very wealthy person could just create an organization and use it to influence a federal agency. I mean, where does it stop? What's to stop others from doing the same thing?
That's the worry, isn't it? That it sets this dangerous precedent. A lot of critics are saying this could really damage our democracy.
Hmm.
It gives so much power to people with a lot of money, and it could really tilt the playing field in their favor.
And we're already seeing some real-world impacts from DOGE's involvement at the CFPB.
Yeah, oh, for sure. One of the very first things that Scott Bessent did after being appointed the acting director, and a lot of people think that was because of Musk,
Right.
he put a hold on a lot of the CFPB's work, developing new regulations,
Yeah.
communications, all that stuff.
So basically, they're just hitting the pause button on everything the CFPB's been working on.
Pretty much. And of course, the Republicans who want to limit the CFPB's power, they're happy about it.
Hmm.
But Democrats and consumer groups, they see this as, an attempt to cripple the CFPB, to keep it from doing its job. It just shows how divided people are about this whole thing.
Yeah, it's hard to see how they'll find a compromise. But let's zoom out a bit. What are the potential long-term consequences here? Could this go beyond the CFPB?
That's a really good question. So, the CFPB gets its funding from the Federal Reserve, right?
Uh-huh.
And the director has a lot of power over how that money is spent.
Mhm.
So if someone who supports Musk's vision becomes the permanent director, well, they could essentially starve the CFPB of the resources it needs to operate, make it almost impossible for them to function.
That's a pretty disturbing thought.
Yeah.
I mean, the CFPB has done a lot of good in terms of holding these financial institutions accountable. If they're weakened or even worse, dismantled, it could have some serious consequences for consumers.
Definitely. It could mean fewer protections against things like predatory lending, unfair debt collection practices, discrimination.
Right.
Consumers could end up paying more, having fewer choices, and just being at a much higher risk of being taken advantage of financially.
And this whole situation could set a precedent for how other billionaires interact with government agencies.
That's a real concern. Could this embolden other extremely wealthy individuals to try and exert their influence over the agencies that regulate their own industries? Just imagine if every billionaire started treating government agencies like their own personal chessboard.
Using their wealth and connections to change the rules in their favor.
Exactly. It would erode trust in government and make the inequality that already exists in our society even worse.
And that brings us right back to those protests outside the CFPB headquarters.
Yeah.
Those people aren't just worried about data security or even the future of this one agency. They're worried about democracy and whether power is becoming too concentrated in the hands of just a few.
You hit the nail on the head. They're fighting for a society where everyone has a fair chance, not just those with wealth and influence.
So there's a lot to think about here. Potential budget cuts, regulatory changes, shifts in power, and of course all this uncertainty about what Musk is really after. But let's shift gears just a little. What's it like inside the CFPB? How are those employees dealing with all this upheaval?
Well, I can only imagine it's incredibly tense. Can you imagine having Elon Musk's team basically setting up shop in your office, watching your every move, and maybe even deciding whether you get to keep your job? It's got to be a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I can only imagine how stressed out and anxious everyone must be. Their whole world has been turned upside down.
The CFPB Employees Union has been very outspoken in opposing DOGE's presence. They call it an invasion and say Musk's team is acting like they own the place.
Wow.
And it's not just about appearances. They're really concerned about data security, the potential for sensitive information to be leaked or misused.
What are they saying specifically?
They're saying DOGE's team doesn't have the right security clearances or expertise to be accessing the CFPB's systems, which, contain very sensitive information about consumers and financial institutions.
Right.
They're worried about what could happen to this information if it falls into the wrong hands. And it's not just the rank and file employees who are worried. Some senior officials at the CFPB have also expressed concerns.
Have there been any direct confrontations?
There have been reports of some pretty heated arguments and clashes between the CFPB staff and DOGE's team. Some employees have said that Musk's allies are arrogant, dismissive, and disrespectful. Like they don't value the work the CFPB staff does or their expertise.
It sounds like a very volatile situation. And the uncertainty surrounding the future of the CFPB probably isn't helping.
Definitely.
Mhm.
Nobody knows for sure what Musk's ultimate goal is. Does he really want to shut down the CFPB entirely? Or is he trying to reshape it according to his own vision? All of this uncertainty is causing a lot of anxiety.
And this is all happening while the CFPB is actually facing an increasing workload. More consumer complaints and all these new financial technologies popping up that need to be regulated.
It's a perfect storm. And it raises the question of whether the CFPB can actually protect consumers under these circumstances. They're being stretched thin at the same time they're facing this major threat.
So far, we've mostly talked about what's going on inside the CFPB. What about the pressure from outside the agency? What are consumer groups and other stakeholders doing about all this?
Oh, they're not just sitting back and watching. They're taking action. launching public awareness campaigns, putting pressure on lawmakers to protect the CFPB. They see this as a critical moment for consumer rights.
What are some of their biggest concerns?
They're saying that the CFPB has been essential in leveling the playing field between consumers and these big, powerful financial institutions.
Right.
They're worried that weakening or eliminating the CFPB would be a major setback for consumer protection.
And I'm guessing they're also worried about those potential conflicts of interest with Musk.
Absolutely. Given his own involvement in the financial technology world, they're concerned that he might use his influence over the CFPB to change regulations in a way that benefits his companies or gives him an advantage over his competitors.
It's a legitimate concern, and it really highlights how important transparency and accountability are in government. We need to make sure that decisions that affect consumers are being made in the best interest of the public, not just a select few. So we've got the CFPB Employees Union fighting to protect their agency consumer advocacy groups, sounding the alarm about the risks to consumers and lawmakers caught in the middle of this partisan battle.
It's a high-stakes fight with a lot riding on the outcome.
And as we've seen throughout this deep dive, this situation has implications that reach far beyond the CFPB. It's about the role of government, the balance of power in our society, and the future of consumer protection.
You said it.
Yeah.
And it's a story that's still unfolding, one that we'll have to continue to watch closely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to turn it back over to you, the listener. What are your thoughts on all of this? What are your biggest concerns? What questions do you still have?
We encourage you to keep digging into this issue. Stay informed about the latest developments and make your voice heard. Reach out to your elected officials and let them know where you stand on the CFPB and the broader issue of consumer protection. Write a letter to your local newspaper. Share your thoughts on social media. Talk to your friends and family about it.
Because ultimately, the future of these agencies and the policies they create is in our hands as citizens. We need to demand transparency, accountability, and a system that works for everyone, not just those at the top.
That's the power of knowledge, and that's what we're all about here at the Deep Dive. We want to equip you with the information and insights you need to make sense of this complex world and make informed decisions.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll continue to explore the most pressing issues of our time, bringing you in-depth analysis and a variety of perspectives.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
And remember, the fight for a fair and just society is never over. We have to stay vigilant and committed to holding those in power accountable.
That's the beauty of knowledge, and it's what the Deep Dive's all about.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.